Hi, and welcome to Climate Bitesize Measuring Your Carbon Footprint. So, to align your decarbonisation plans with the Paris Agreement, all organisations need to reach net zero emissions by 2050. 2050 seems a while out, but we'll need a good roadmap that breaks down the process into small, achievable targets. The general consensus is that organisations need to halve their emissions every 10 years. Today, we're with Mercedes from Foundation Scotland, who is going to share the experience of measuring Foundation Scotland's carbon footprint. Hey, Mercedes, thank you for joining us today and to be here to share your experience.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So let's get straight to it. So when organisations start to look at what to include in a climate strategy, often the first thing that comes up is decarbonising your operations. What does this actually mean?
Yeah, I think climate-related subjects and actions are always quite full of jargon and can be quite intimidating. But decarbonising operations essentially means taking steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with your direct and sometimes indirect activities. I think within the third sector, especially with funders, it's quite important to differentiate between direct, i.e., what a foundation has direct control or responsibility over, and indirect, essentially when a foundation has a connection to something but not direct control. And usually those indirect emissions tend to be the grants themselves. But I mean, in any case, decarbonising can involve, obvious practical things like looking at your energy consumption, transport, business logistics, and the measurements of these elements can allow organisations to see what their output is.
Thank you, that's clearer. So what advice do you have for community foundations getting started with decarbonising their operations?
I think decarbonising often requires new strategies, policies, a change of mindset for staff and board members. It's a really large undertaking, and I think people are quite keen to get started. But my advice would be that with decarbonising, it's definitely a marathon and not a sprint. When we took our journey to decarbonise, it took much longer than expected, and I mean, we're still doing that. It's not a tick box exercise, and I don't think it should be treated as such. The offsetting sector, so organisations that can provide those services, that's still relatively young, and there's so much more to learn. And this can kind of feel quite overwhelming. So I think my advice is really to reach out to experts in the field. Don't be afraid to share your struggles with other funders, because we're essentially all in the same place together when we talk about climate action.
Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, I think with all climate things, we've talked about being on a journey and everyone is at a different point in their journey. And everything also takes longer than than you think. Okay, so get how did you choose your external auditor?
So again, that was sort of a long journey. We were very keen because we are Scotland's community foundation and we're the only one within Scotland. We wanted to try and integrate Scotland and Scottish providers into the whole process, whether it be the person doing the climate audit or the organisation that was offsetting. So we actually reached out to sort of various stakeholders within the sector, and we contracted a Glasgow-based provider, and that organisation essentially conducted a climate emission audit for us, which allowed us to measure our carbon footprint. And that was very much sort of quite a long monthly process, but it included lots of dialogue, and it was quite an interesting exercise actually to see the different data sets that were coming out, because we really didn't have that much of a clear picture in terms of what our sort of emissions were going to be.
And just a sub question, were you surprised with how much carbon you're producing, or was it like, oh, that's not too bad?
So I think, the key caveat to it all was we did this post pandemic.
Hmm.
And so within that context of like the post COVID-19 society in which we were all working remotely, the footprint didn't necessarily reflect what had been traditionally doing. So actually our footprint was not substantial. When we didn't, see anything that was that shocking. But of course, we saw that there were various elements within our operations that meant that we could actually, actively reduce our emissions. So as part of that sort of process with the organisation that did the audit, they also looked at various ways in which we could decarbonise certain elements of the foundation. And that was really, really helpful in terms of having a starting point from which we could move forward on.
Brilliant. So I've heard a good place to start is easy emissions, especially if you have an office building, for example. But as a mainly remote organisation, where did you start?
Yeah, I mean, so traditionally we did have offices, but again, as I said, COVID-19 has made this slightly easier for all organisations. We have staff that are sort of dotted around the whole region of Scotland, and it simply didn't make sense for us to maintain multiple offices due to the pandemic. Having said that, we all work remotely, but we do have the option for some hybrid working in co-working spaces so that we can connect with our stakeholders. So I think that was sort of the first step for us in terms of easy emissions, being able to have like a mainly remote organisation, but still maintain a bit of connectivity.
So yeah, then I would imagine that travel is another hotspot. And how do you manage that?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting within the context of Scotland. Obviously, we have staff right up in the far north in Caithness, and we have staff in the Central Belt, and sometimes it can require travel to and from remote areas. But when we were deciding our sustainable travel regulations, we actually outlined that in our own environmental policy, which is on our website. So we publish our environmental policies so that everyone can see it. And when we talked about our attitude towards travel, we essentially adopted what's called the carbon management hierarchy for travel. And what that does is it's essentially like a pyramid structure. And the argument is that you can minimize travel through efficient planning and alternatives. So things like video conferencing, which we're all much more familiar with because of the pandemic. Um, and sort of the general standard rule is that employees work remotely, but public transport's prioritised, car sharing is encouraged. Air travel would be an absolute last resort, and it's very, very rarely, if ever, done within the foundation. So just, I think, being able to plan ahead. And we recognise that some staff members, like I'm based in Edinburgh, it's easier for me to get around via public transport. So I think when we looked at travel, it was really just looking at it from like a practical viewpoint of things that made sense.
Brilliant, thank you. So do you talk to your grantees about reducing their emissions?
Um, I would say we're definitely at the beginning of our journey on this, but I think it's important for third sector organisations to recognise that funders might not always be the best organisations to offer advice on climate. Um, I mean, there's loads of different organisations and bodies specifically for Scotland and outside of it that are on hand to offer advice on lots of different subjects, things like sustainable capital projects or how to support more small charities to be more sustainable. So I think for us, our work has largely been about signposting, offering a directory of support for applicant organisations and grantees, rather than, sort of actively engaging them in discussion and telling them what to do. And in Scotland, we're really blessed with lots of great organisations. So examples for us are Business Energy Scotland, Nature Scot, Keep Scotland Beautiful, and the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations have also done lots of work and research over the last few years to help small applicant organisations with their sustainability.
Excellent. Might have to have a look at some of those links. Okay, so you've measured your carbon and then you're reducing it, but what do you do with the remaining emissions that can't be reduced?
Yeah, I think it's quite an interesting one when we're talking about emissions and funders, because I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's this idea of indirect emissions and the fact that we are essentially connected to the grants themselves, but we have no direct responsibility over them. And because of that, there are some emissions that we don't have complete control over. So when we did do our audit and measured our footprint, we wanted the data to be sort of fair and transparent. In terms of what we've done with things that can't be reduced, I mean, talked about travel, there are various things that, are just part of day-to-day life. And we have to recognise that, employees have to put a kettle on or heat their home, those simple things. So I think it's also about not being too hard on yourself as an organisation. We can't get everything perfect. But in terms of actually offsetting what we can do, reducing the emissions that we know we have made, when we had our audit done, we decided that we wanted to do something that was authentic, but also because our footprint was quite small, we decided that we wanted to go above sort of that threshold when offsetting, so that we were not only offsetting in real time, but we were also offsetting our future emissions. And I think, I mean, it's important to say that this wasn't a one-off thing. We're going to continuously be doing this in the future so that we can have a sort of full grip on our emissions. And so when we made the decision to offset, as I mentioned, we wanted to do something in Scotland. So we reached out to an organisation who are essentially doing forest restoration work, planting new trees down in the Scottish borders. And that project is essentially the future offsetting. And then in order to make sure that we could offset in real time, we reached out to another organisation that had offsetting projects abroad. And I think UK funders might be a bit confused about that, but essentially for context, most UK-based offsetting projects aren't actually able to offset in real time because the trees that are planted are not at a mature enough age in which they can offset right now. So in order to sort of make sure we were doing everything in real time, we went for a project in South America. And this just allowed us to balance sort of what we can reduce in the moment and what we can reduce in the future.
I think that's really interesting, isn't it? Because if you Google carbon offsetting, like I'm sure a lot of us does, there's just an overwhelming amount of organizations who are doing things, but understanding what it actually is the first step. And then, yeah, offsetting future. So the trees, I guess, in the borders will be in 10, 20 years being able to offset. But for now,
Yeah. And it was important for us that we could see that happening on our doorstep within our patch, and especially the Scottish Borders is where we have a lot of place-based funding. It's connected to the Scottish Borders Trust, so they've historically been a grantee of ours. We really wanted to have that connection and not just, I don't know, we didn't want it to feel like it was just a greenwashing exercise. We wanted it to be a bit more tangible for us.
Brilliant. So have you got any tips for community foundations who are just starting on this journey?
I mean, I think my biggest tip would just be to reach out to other funders. In Scotland, we're really lucky to have various different funders forums, so we always share our ideas. But I think the enormity of the climate emergency can make you feel like if you have a climate working group within your organisation, it can just feel quite overwhelming, and it can be a full-time job and you might not know where to start. So I think, it's probably better to share your experiences because we're all on a learning journey. With things like carbon offsetting, we really had no idea what we were sort of stepping into. And so if we can help other foundations sort of commence their own journey, then I think sharing best practice is probably the best tip.
Brilliant, thank you. So this is the end of our Climate Bite Size, but we will be coming back for a full session on this for people to come and ask Mercedes questions. And I think there are some other community foundations who are on their journey as well, so we can perhaps have a panel and have a good discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.